Hello everyone, welcome back to Trek Day. I'm finally caught up with Star Trek Strange New Worlds, having watched 4.5 Vulcans this morning. I think this will be a bit of a long one, and probably not my usual tone, as I feel that it's necessary to go on a bit of a tirade. If you've been watching my videos for a while, you're aware to the extent to which I love Star Trek, how impactful it's been to my growth as a person. Its principles are what I strive to live by, and it really formed a significant segment of the lens through which I view the world, and I hope a lot of that has come through in my videos, particularly some series talking about a lot of my favorite episodes or characters. I feel like a lot of that has come through the channel, my way of really sharing my love of the franchise. And that is why my content is generally focused on the positive promotion of Star Trek and adoration. And I try my best to find positive elements gleaning from even the, shall we say, least impressive parts of the franchise these days. But today I can't do that. This travesty joins the ranks of the Section 31 disaster as indefensible, honestly enraging, and sadly offensive. And if you are new to the channel and you're stumbling upon my videos for the first time, no, this is not one of those new Trek, NU Trek-hating channels. I actually have a lot of positive things to say about some of the newer Star Trek. It's not all been good, probably like 60% bad, but there's been some really good stuff with Prodigy and Lower Decks, third season of Star Trek Picard, even a lot of Strange New Worlds. I am, I think very obviously at this point, not going to be speaking positively about this episode, but I actually like some of Strange New Worlds, particularly Season 1, so no, this is, if you're here for the first time, that's not this type of channel normally. And I have no issue with Star Trek being silly. Again, if you are familiar with my perspective on Star Trek and you've watched my top 100 favorite episodes of Star Trek series, you are well aware of this. But humor still needs grounding within the established fictional reality of the world in which it takes place, and needs to be more meaningful than just a comedy merely for the sake of comedy. It needs to have a more purposeful element to work with. Comedy comes from conflict which is relatable and makes sense for the characters while maintaining an understanding of the basic truths of Star Trek. It needs to say something about its characters, or function as a growth of relationships, or be a comedy with stakes. Deep Space Nine's The Magnificent Ferengi is a great example of a comedy that works because of the stakes of the situation. Silly can be fun, but it needs to have a point. A Fistful of Datas is extremely silly, but it works because it examines the relationship between Worf and Alexander, and the source of the goofiness makes sense within the context of the universe it takes place in. Cupid from TNG is a silly Robin Hood episode, but it has the point of finally addressing and defining Picard and Vosh's relationship, and the humor makes sense within the personalities of these already established characters, so it works. Comedy has always been an important part of Star Trek, but it has been more akin to funny moments and dialogues and things that feel relatable to real relationships within an otherwise straight-faced narrative. Comedic episodes were exactly that, comedic, where the comedic element was perhaps a larger than average percentage of the episode, but not a full-blown sitcom, unless that is the intent of the series, which is uniquely like the Lower Decks, like why that is a comedy first and foremost. This episode then feels like Strange New Worlds trying to pull off a live-action Lower Decks, but somehow even fails to do so because it doesn't understand why that show worked for many fans, certainly not all. Lower Decks was primarily a comedy, but under its silly animated antics, it actually remained truthful to the underpinning rules and truths of Star Trek and tried to say something. The comedy of Lower Decks wasn't always to my taste either, but I ended up overall liking most of, if not all, the show because the underlying storytelling was still there. You could take any episode of Lower Decks and rewrite it as a more serious TNG-style episode of Star Trek, and the characters would still work. It was an over-the-top comedy that was often too ridiculous for me, but if you stripped away the comedy, there was still something there celebrating the love of Star Trek and an understanding of its perspective and messaging. However, this episode of Strange New Worlds, 4.5 Vulcans, this is trash, is unfunny, uncomfortable, and shows an embarrassing lack of understanding of Star Trek, and his pointless drivel that dares to pretend that saying something about Spock and his conflict with his half-human, half-Vulcan heritage. It treats its audience like imbecilic drones who don't watch Star Trek with any analytical thought, allowing themselves to be enveloped in the universe of Star Trek for an hour to where it feels like a temporary reality, but instead stare at the screen or half-watch while scrolling on their phones, absorbing content instead of interacting with a story. This felt like a 40-minute pull-my-finger fart joke that, if stripped of the comedy, would be devoid of any meaning, and even a cursory examination would expose it as absurd and offensive, which is a term that is very rarely applied to Star Trek for me. It's really sad to think of. Watching this, it was as if the expectation is that the audience's intellectual engagement with Star Trek is at the level of watching an episode of Full House. And I guess if that is the extent of your involvement with Star Trek, just a very casual viewing for mindless entertainment without even the most rudimentary attempt at thinking about the stories or the characters beyond the superficial depth of a bad commercial, then perhaps you glean something resembling enjoyment from this farce. However, I did not. And there are a lot of pieces to talk about why. Starting off with how in Star Trek, scientific plausibility used to be the standard. Science so beyond our comprehension that it becomes indistinguishable from magic was reserved for beings like Q, or likewise beings or situations presented as being even far beyond Starfleet's capabilities to accurately explain. Otherwise, that which is obviously beyond our real-life current technological capabilities had to at least have some fictional explanation, affectionately dubbed technobabble, that led credible plausibility within the confines of the pre-established technology within the universe of the show. Do we have warp drive, transporters, replicators, inertial dampeners, and artificial gravity at the scale of a city-sized starship in real life? No. But I can explain with exacting detail how each one of those systems works within Star Trek, and give a scientifically plausible, if not entirely possible, within the context of our current real-life understanding, reasoning for its functionality. Even when something is invented because of real-life production issues, original series Transporter was invented because they didn't have the time or the budget to constantly show a shuttle or some sort of craft landing in every episode. There at least then had to be, okay, how do we give this a credible explanation of how this works? It's not just a magic take you here, put you there. How does it do it? There has to be some sort of logical reasoning behind even the most fanciful elements. It's a grounding and logical reasoning of these more fantastical fictional elements that helps separate science fiction from fantasy and help to make Star Trek feel alive. It's part of what gives a well-written character a world to live in. But here, all that is thrown out the airlock with, and I'm forced to reiterate, shallow writing insultingly, seemingly crafted with the expectation that the audience is intellectually inept. As a nonsense serum is used to genetically alter members of the crew into Vulcans to bypass a security scan, putting aside the obvious implications that this magic potion is more advanced than anything used to send officers on similar missions far into the future in shows like TNG or DS9. It's really just this easy and lazy way of avoiding any thoughtful explanation of how to pull off this feat, with a combination of temporary cosmetic alterations and some clever ruse to avoid detection, stuff that's been shown before, plus this seemingly acceptable total genetic manipulation in a show that heavily focuses on how frowned upon such things are through characters like Una and La'an. Somehow within this stupid comedy, they find a way to devalue some of the aspects of the show that actually are usually very well written and explored. And then we get this added absurdity that this magic serum is derived partially from Spock's DNA, and that it transfers a sort of genetic memory that bypasses actual real-life experiences in order to give them this innate ability to control their emotions, to try and get the Vulcan caricatures that they wanted to use for the comedy. It's lazily written nonsense as a workaround for any reasonable explanation. It's a backwards way of getting comedy, too. We want to make this joke of the arrogant, superior feeling Vulcans, so how do we invent something to make that happen, rather than coming up with the scenario and then trying to figure out, okay, here's the situation, now how do we make it funny, or how do we put in jokes? It's the joke first before the situation in which the joke takes place. And then that leads to no credibility. It also disturbingly comes across as both lacking in basic comprehension of genetics and as weirdly and frighteningly has racist undertones. These Vulcanized versions of our characters are a combination of the existing person infused with Spock's life experiences somehow, and influenced by that character's preconceived notions of what it is to be Vulcan, and outlandishly exaggerated aspects of their personalities that fit into the parameters of this new caricature, which is then used to facilitate the comedy. Vulcans are not emotionless. They have extreme emotional control, and those are very different things. The commonly stoic, logical, emotionally controlled, air of superiority, often judgmental portrayal of Vulcans is a cultural construct, not a genetic trait. The entire history of Vulcan culture shows how this state of being is actually entirely against any genetic-driven proclivities and requires a lifetime of dedication to maintain. This casual explanation of how this is bypassed by this silly, lazy, nonsensical, and hard portrayals of these robotic, stereotype-driven characters as Vulcans. Anson Mount in particular, I don't know what the heck his acting choices were in this episode, and usually I like him, but infuriating. This, I repeat again, robotic, just bizarre. Like it's difficult to play a Vulcan. They really show here how hard it is to play an emotionally controlled being rather than an emotionalist being, and feeding into these living stereotype-driven characters feels distressingly like some sort of blackface, depicting negative cultural stereotypes as having a genetic basis. I mean, it is gross. It was uncomfortable to watch and disgusting to think that it was coming from Star Trek, and reinforced by this constant berating of Spock's half-Vulcanness in some rough draft feeling attempt to elicit sympathy and understanding of Spock's struggles. And that was infuriating because that's something that could have been done well. That's something that is an interesting element of that character, and here it didn't feel like a sympathetic exploration of that character's struggles. Even the aspects of the story that had potential, La'an's more Romulan transformation and her struggles with her own issues with her genetic background, that could have been fascinating. I think it could have been an interesting take to kind of keep her as this Romulan type character and temporarily turn her into a villain. Like, there's so many kind of cool things they could have done with that, and it just fell flat and dug a Vulcan interested in humanity, an idea that harkens back to one of my favorite episodes of Enterprise, Carbon Creek, something that could have really been fascinating to explore, were hampered by this poorly conceived mess. And I haven't even mentioned them shoehorning in Kirk again, because of course they did. This episode was a disaster. Again, I always try and look for the good in something, even if I'm not enjoying it. It is rare that I genuinely dislike an episode of Star Trek and cannot find something to like in it. Even if I come across an episode that my overall feeling is very, very negative, I can at least point to, well, at least this one thing was a good idea, they just didn't know what to do with it, or at least this one scene worked, or something. So it's even more so exceptionally rare. I can barely think of any examples, just a couple here or there, to where I don't just dislike, but I'm actively offended and truly hate an episode. Sadly, this has achieved that rare scenario. From beginning to end, from every conceivable angle, This was despicable trash that treats its audience like fools.